Tonight on Zadanza, we'll be talking about the Vatican's decision to bless gay marriage and how people are reacting to it. So join us for that if you want. Show starts at 10 Eastern. So hey everybody, today we're going to watch Father Casey Cole talk about how Christians should share their faith with others. Should they lay out some kind of logical, evidence-based case for what they believe? Or just say they take it all on faith? Now I found this video kind of silly at a glance, but actually ends up kind of bringing up some interesting questions, so let's take a look.
The idea of there being a powerful cosmic being responsible for creating and controlling the universe used to be commonplace. For the vast majority of human history, those who denied supernatural forces would have been in the extreme minority, and so articulating why we believe in one was often unnecessary.
Oh, the good old days when we didn't even have to explain ourselves. Like, if I had a religion that stood the test of time by engendering conformity instead of standing up to scrutiny, I am not sure I'd be in a big hurry to say so.
That is not the case today. As atheism continues to grow, people of faith are all of a sudden having to defend their own existence.
I'm not so sure they find themselves having to defend their existence. Sounds kind of dramatic. It's more like they have to defend their ideas, and all I have to say to that is good.
Is this not just superstition? Has science not debunked the naivete of our ancient forefathers?
This is really a pretty crude way of framing the discussion. A much better way to put it would be to say that science has kind of helped our thinking mature and become more precise. And this is an important distinction, because scientifically actually disproving religion is kind of a difficult thing to do, at least conclusively, especially with a number of different forms of religions and ways of expressing it that there are. So what happens is, if it gets framed as a question of science disproving a religion or not, then all a religious person has to do is cast any kind of doubt on the question of whether science has swooped in and just disproven religion, and it ends up looking more credible than it really is. That's why what I prefer to do is show how science has kind of chipped away at all these little superstitions and just made religion a little more answerable to what it claims, which is why Father Casey kind of bemoans the fact that, Christianity actually has to explain itself a little bit now. Boo-hoo. This does make the non-religious population rise and even leads the religious population to think in more non-religious ways. So really the question of whether science has debunked religion as a distraction. Science has put religion in a chokehold where it has to account for itself, and that's just a good thing.
Untrained in this sort of debate, some Christians attempt to frame their answer in the atheist language.
So they say words like and
They try to prove mathematically, prove empirically, that there must be a God. Using logic, pointing to the unexplained, presenting what they believe to be forensic evidence of God's past deeds, they engage the question as if it were a question of science.
And while that's a foolhardy mission, it's literally the only way to show that your claim should be taken seriously.
But this is simply not the case. Our belief in God is not a matter of fact, not a result of verifiable sense data. It's the result of faith. To look for fingerprints or mathematical proofs is to look for God in the wrong places. It's an attempt to replace faith with certainty.
Okay, at this point, I'm really curious where this video is headed. Because when you title something, Why Believe in God, I would think the whole point is to, discuss reasons? And you would think those reasons should be as good as possible, right? Or, at least passable if you're a little lazy. But this guy just comes right out and rejects the idea of looking for actual verifiable reasons to believe in God and suggests the literal worst reason to believe in anything, which is faith. Now, I do know the word faith can be a little fluid. A lot of Christians like to say that it's more ongoing trust in a God who they already know exists for good reasons. Kind of like you have faith that your parents are going to be good to you and take care of you and stuff. But that's clearly not what Father Casey's talking about. He's talking about belief in God, not trusting God. Besides, until you have some kind of actual verifiable reason to believe he exists and to establish a trustworthy pattern of behavior, the kind of actual verifiable evidence Casey just said you shouldn't even be trying to look for, then you can't establish the trust kind of faith either. As Aaron Ross says, if you can't show it, you don't know it. So for Father Casey to say that we need to rely on faith instead of demonstrating God exists seems to indicate that we can't know he exists. And I couldn't possibly imagine him admitting to that.
The only fact of the matter, what must guide our inquiry into this question, is that we don't know for certain that there's a God. We don't.
Didn't see that coming.
At least not in the same way that we know that 2 plus 2 is 4, or that gravity is a force that brings bodies of matter together.
So how do we know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, that gravity brings things together? We observe them. That's the only way to actually know anything. So I take his statement that we don't know God exists in the same way to mean that we don't actually know he exists at all.
If God were an observable fact, then there would be no choice to believe, no room for free love, no faith.
Oh boy, this one again. Like, why does it matter if we have a choice to believe in God? How is that the starting point for like a healthier or fuller relationship with him? Like, we could have absolutely full knowledge of him, in fact, have him be the most evident part of our daily existence, and we would still have the exact same choice whether to love him, hate him, or just be indifferent toward him. Knowing he exists has nothing to do with free will at all, and this is one of the most transparently desperate apologetics I've ever heard. Also, and this is just totally a throwaway, God not revealing himself doesn't give you more choice to believe or not believe. It just makes you more likely to be wrong by accident. Now, yeah, I guess there is more room for faith, but like, who cares about that?
God is not a fact. But that doesn't mean that God can't be known to those who have been given the gift of faith.
So we can't know God exists, but if you have faith, he can be known to you. This is just saying you can know God exists, but you can't know God exists, switching to passive voice halfway through the sentence. It doesn't make any sense. Also, the gift of faith, that's weird. Believing things without a good reason isn't a gift. It's just something you can choose to do or not depending on how bad of judgment you have. But the contradictions here are just really obvious and, to be honest, probably kind of beside the point. What I'm interested in is what Father Casey's trying to convey to his audience. He seems to be saying, don't worry about the evidence, none of it matters. You should just take it on faith. Basically, active apologetics misses the point. You shouldn't be relying on mathematics, evidence, logic, all of that kind of stuff. And if you use it, you're speaking the language of atheists and kind of doing things on their terms. You know, basically using all the intelligent and reliable tools we have to come to conclusions about anything. You don't need all that. Just believe by faith like we did back in the good old days before anybody ever challenged Christianity, or could get away with it. It is a weird thing to admit, but there's kind of a refreshing honesty to it. Like, I think faith is the reason anyway, and apologetics is just this really obnoxiously elaborate backdoor way to justify it. So maybe if they just come out and say they believe on faith, it simplifies the conversation. I don't know, like, if you're discussing Christianity with a Christian who uses apologetics, I don't think they believe because of apologetics. At the core, there is this faith-based, unshakable reason for belief. And so maybe wandering through apologetics just creates a lot of frustration, and just saying, hey, I'm going to stubbornly believe no matter what, that sets the terms of the conversation and you can avoid all kinds of misunderstanding. I don't know. Still kind of weird though. But here's what I'm curious about. If he's just going to say take it on faith, then what is there to talk about for the rest of the video? Like, you can expound upon mathematical reasons to believe, logical reasons to believe, historical evidence or whatever. It's all nonsense, but at least it gives you something to talk about. How do you talk about just have faith for another, like 4 minutes or so? I'm not really sure, but I guess let's see what he comes up with.
For those who believe, evidence abounds. For one, we're privileged with innumerable accounts of those who have witnessed God with their own eyes. Our scriptures testify that for more than a millennia, God spoke to his people through angels, powerful plagues, and direct commands. Witnesses saw the living and true God of Jesus Christ heal the sick and raise the dead.
So you have people saying that supernatural things happened a long time ago, just like all kinds of religions and cultures all across the world. Cool.
A fraud does not have the immediate success that he had. A fake does not transform an entire region of the world overnight. People saw with their eyes and professed with their lips a God who worked wonders, who spoke clearly, who heard their prayers and answered them. For many, their testimony is enough to believe.
So apparently Jesus must have been God because if he weren't, he couldn't have had such an impact overnight. But here's one problem. Uh, Jesus didn't impact anything overnight, even his own region of the world. Christianity influenced its region over the course of decades, probably due more to other Christians than to any historical or idealized Christ figure. Basically, it grew and spread like any other successful religion in the world. But I don't think Father Casey's going to claim that all those religions need to be explained by something other than fraud, right? No, that line of reasoning is reserved specifically for Christianity. A fraud couldn't have set off the influence we see from Christianity. His followers report him doing wonders, and I guess this all serves as forensic evidence of God's past deeds. But wait. I thought we weren't supposed to argue stuff like this because it was speaking the language of atheists and using, logic and evidence and stuff. So what's up? I don't know. Kind of looks like Father Casey's waffling here a little bit, right? But surely this has to be a one-off, right? No way Father Casey is going to tell us to rely on faith instead of apologetics and evidence and then spend the rest of the video going over various different standard arguments for God. Nah, not going to happen, right?
For the more philosophically minded, we find reason to believe because we cannot imagine an infinite regress of time and space. Where did it all come from?
Oh, great. So this is a list of arguments. And he just plows straight on through into the first cause argument. Awesome.
We can say that humans adapted from primitive monkeys that evolved from primitive mammals that go back to some primitive goo that ultimately go back to the Big Bang. But what caused the Big Bang? Where did these atoms come from? Who created them?
I don't know, but I'm not in the habit of giving up and saying, well, a supernatural being must have done it every time I find a problem puzzling. Also, by the way, where did God come from? If your answer is that he's eternal and timeless, how does that work? And how can someone experience consciousness without the passage of time? If God's perfect and complete on his own, why did he create humans to fellowship with? And how did he decide to do it without the passage of time? Did he go from not wanting to create humans to wanting to create humans? How did the timelessness of his existence intersect with our universe's stream of time? Can you describe anything about the mechanics of how he spoke the universe into existence? I find it interesting that if we can't provide a full, detailed, intuitive explanation for everything about how the universe came about naturally, apologists say, see, God must have done it. But as soon as the conversation turns to how God must have done it, apologists are like, well, there's a lot of things that we just can't know about God and it's just a mystery. It's just about the most obvious and devious switcheroo I've ever seen pulled on any topic.
To go back and back and back to infinity just doesn't make sense.
Just like a timeless being who experiences a flow of conscious thoughts doesn't make sense. If you're going to strike one for not being immediately intuitive, why not strike the other one?
There must be a first cause, a first mover of history that is outside of time and space. There must be a reason why there is something rather than nothing.
Must there be a reason why there is God instead of no God?
For many, the illogical nature of purely material existence is enough to believe.
Or to put it more accurately, the fact that everything about the universe isn't immediately intuitive and accessible to them is enough to make them throw up their hands and say, well, I'll just believe in this supernatural thing that also isn't intuitive and accessible. Basically, it's just superstition.
Others begin with the human experience, the intimate knowledge of self. Within our being is a desire to know. Our nature is disposed to discovery, self-reflection, and identity, inexhaustible desires within us that reach forward infinitely. With everything we learn, everything we answer, we are left with 10 more questions, leaving us to conclude that we are not beings that will ever be satisfied with something, but rather seeking out infinity itself, God.
What Father Casey's explaining here is actually one of the most insidious things about religion. Yes, we do have this deep desire to know and keep learning, but the only way to actually know is through observation. And the way we learn more is to go out and explore so we can observe more things. This is what gives us our instinct to explore, which is one of the most profoundly fulfilling things we can do. Yes, every answer we get leads us to more questions. But the nice thing about those questions? They give us more answers that we can find. It's like the universe is just this amazing gift that keeps on giving, and it's going to keep giving and keep giving and keep giving as long as we're around and have this instinct to keep opening the gifts. The fact that we're never satisfied is actually the reason to keep going, to actually observe and learn new things. What Father Casey suggests is actually the termination of this process, and I just find that just deeply terrible. He's just kind of like, Well, every answer we come up with just leads to more questions, so this tells us it's all infinite and therefore it must be God, and let's just settle for that. Like, he doesn't say stop exploring, but there's something about just telling us that we're on an infinite treadmill, therefore it leads us to some answer that's a shortcut to some of these questions. I don't know. It's not really an injunction to stop exploring, but it kind of does give permission to stop. It contextualizes all of this in terms of this big, huge answer, and that answer does kind of tell you when you get to something difficult like morality or the origin of the universe. Just say God did it, which is what Christians do a lot, and which is something Father Casey has actually modeled doing earlier in this video. It kind of puts a halt to knowledge and runs against the best of everything that makes us human.
It is against the backdrop of this infinite horizon that we discover who we are and where we are going.
No, you navigate where you're going by looking for signs of where you are and where you've been so you can make intelligent predictions. Deciding that a vast quest must be an infinite quest, therefore a sign from God, is going to get you plotting your course on randomly drawn maps instead of looking to the stars.
For many, the boundless desire within us is enough to believe. But of course, there is a final way to know. It is the purest and most simple of explanations. There are some of us that have personally encountered God.
No, they really haven't. Not in any obvious, verifiable way, anyway. All they've encountered is emotions and state of mind they don't fully understand. And I'm willing to bet money that's all Father Casey's going to describe. Just wait and see.
Maybe we've witnessed a miracle or heard his voice speak within us.
So they saw something they didn't understand or heard their own thoughts.
Maybe we felt undeniable comfort in the midst of tragedy, had a life-changing experience with no other explanation than God's loving hand.
So they had warm internal feelings when experiencing trauma. And I'm not going to take that lightly. I've been there. I have thought it was God before. But I only thought that because I was trained to think it was God, because I wanted to think it was God, because I thought it was virtuous to think it was God. But if you ever experience a feeling, all it was a feeling. If you ever have a sudden change in your habits, all it was a change in your habits. Now I know sometimes it can be legitimately hard to understand why these things happen, why you feel certain things, why you might suddenly change in some way or another. But if you do, spend some time in personal reflection. Introspect on where you were emotionally at that time, what kinds of thoughts and circumstances led to it, how the emotion rose and faded. And you're probably not going to fully get it right away, so take some time. Talk to people you trust, or a professional if that helps. There's no shame in that. But doing all this is going to help you actually process and regulate your emotions, as well as maintain any positive changes you feel like you've undergone. Deciding all these things must just be the loving hand of God just because you don't immediately get it, therefore there's no explanation, robs you of all these opportunities for personal growth. And, it's sad, but there's a good chance it's just going to send you through cycles of unconstructive behavior. Sin, cry, repent, sin, cry, repent. I mean, it sounds like I'm making fun, but it is really sad, and people do get locked into it. You got to find a way to do something better.
This is why I believe, truly. Trusting in others, seeking God in philosophy and anthropology makes sense and give greater meaning to what I know. When it comes down to it, the reason I believe is because I have felt his healing presence in my life. In a time of great distress, I was given comfort and released of my pain. In moments of immense isolation, I have felt a loving embrace.
No, you didn't feel a loving embrace, and I'm pretty sure you'd own up to that if I could ask you some clarifying questions. You're using that phrase as a figure of speech for something that happened inside and then abusing the metaphor by implying somebody actually embraced you. If God really existed and really gave you a hug, you wouldn't need to play these kinds of language games.
I haven't seen a supernatural being in my midst and haven't had any ecstatic experiences, but I have encountered God on more than a few occasions. It's the sort of knowing on the level of love, a feeling that burns so powerfully and clearly that nothing could ever call it into question, and yet there's no data to convince another of its existence.
If nothing can get you to call it into question, then it's probably worth stopping to think about why. The emotion itself probably communicated literally nothing about God. All the information you have about God came from religious instruction, and you just imported it into that feeling because it's the only thing that you felt that was vague enough that you could attribute it to God instead of something else. If you can't be shaken from the conclusion that this feeling inside you just connects directly to all these otherwise totally unverifiable things you've learned about religion, then it's probably because you're just so starved for any kind of validation about your God's existence that you're holding on to it for dear life. Also, you've probably been taught that it's just kind of virtuous to assume it's God.
That feeling, that experience, however nebulous and unverifiable for you, is enough for me.
And that really is a shame.
That is what inspires me to believe, what gives me life, that overcomes the many feelings of doubt in my life. Maybe that's sufficient for you, maybe it's not.
So surprised, like I predicted, he didn't as much as describe anything about seeing God. He just described emotions that he says came from God. Now, he's going to spend the last little bit of this video encouraging Christians to describe why they believe, so we're just going to kind of leave off there. What I find interesting is how he wavers back and forth in his description of why you should believe in God. He starts by dumping on apologetics, which is, kind of cool, and says that you should just believe on faith. But then he immediately reverses course and starts running through all the apologetics he just told everybody not to rely on. And then in the end, he kind of circles from that to like your internal feeling of belief, and I think he kind of tries to fuzzy the two. So I guess in the end, the question is, what do we make of all this? There seems to be a little bit of a tension here between faith and reliance on evidence, and both of them have their appeal for Father Casey apparently and for Christians in general. After all, you do want the credibility of having evidence, right? You don't want to just be that person that just believes just to believe. But on the other hand, faith gives you an out whenever the evidence, ends up not being there. And a lot of Christians see just trusting God as more virtuous and humble than running around making egg-headed arguments. What I see this video as, and it actually is kind of interesting, is an attempt not only at reconciling these two ideas, but trying to come up with some kind of synergy between the two of them. When you take a careful and charitable look at what Father Casey said, there isn't really as much of a contradiction as it seems at first. Yes, he starts with faith and then wanders into apologetics. But what role does apologetics play? According to him anyway, it's not exactly the foundation of your faith. It's something that once you actually have faith, is just kind of there and available for you. And this does something kind of clever, really. It kind of reduces apologetics to this safe little excursion Christians can go on if they want. Nothing's really at stake because apologetics doesn't prove it or not. You already have that grounding in faith. You're going to believe no matter what. That's the actual reason. And the apologetics is just, you can treat it like a fun little puzzle. You can kind of just get into it for fun or whatever sense of validation it gives you. I think that's kind of how apologetics works anyway, and I think Father Casey really kind of tapped into something. It's a little bit like how William Lane Craig spends all this time going through all these elaborate arguments and then just pulls the ripcord with this, inner witness of the Holy Spirit thing. You can argue, but you have a way out because nothing really depended on the arguments to begin with. As silly as this video seems at a glance, I think it really does capture something about the role that faith and apologetics plays in the mind of a Christian, and how they kind of subconsciously in this fuzzy way wander back and forth between the two. I don't think they do it on purpose. I definitely don't think they do it maliciously, at least not in most cases. But it can lead to some frustration when you're talking to Christians because they might be subconsciously making the best use of both of these concepts at any point in the conversation, and it can make it very hard to get any kind of headway. So I guess the question is, if this is happening, what do we do with it? Do we just sit around and complain? Well, obviously no. If you're in a healthy place to do it and you have Christians in your life, I think you want to engage in some kind of healthy, productive conversation. And there's no easy way around this. This is going to be tricky. There's a lot of thoughts swirling around in there. And the more sincere the Christian is, the less aware they're going to be of it. And thus, the more you and they might step on each other's toes without even understanding why. So in the long run, I think there is some benefit to trying to understand how and when and to what extent Christians are relying on faith, what it really means to them when they bring up apologetics, and also how evidence can kind of just bleed into these general internal intuitions. Now, when you're thinking through this, you definitely want to be respectful and avoid jumping to conclusions, just like you don't want them jumping to conclusions about you. But hopefully there's something here you can take away, even if there's no real quick solution, even if, you don't find some angle to work into a conversation, you can at least have a little more potential insight or be a little more understanding. And maybe that'll make the conversations a little more constructive. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.